A turn to the right for the Kansas State House this year. Plus, there will be at least 2 new Kansas faces in the halls of Congress. And the battle for Pat Roberts' Senate seat is down to 3. We're talking all things primary this election week right now on Kansas Week.
Southwest National Bank has proudly served Wichita and its surrounding communities for over 100 years. We are happy to support KPTS, Public Television for Kansas.
This is Kansas Week, and I'm Pilar Pedraza. The eyes of many across the nation were on one race in Kansas this week, the fight for an open U.S. Senate seat. The results came with a few surprises, as Cake's Allison Acklin and Greg Miller showed us.
Next senator from the state of Kansas.
In his speech, Roger Marshall called the primary a hard race, pointing to all those negative ads you saw over the last few weeks. But he also said that moving forward, he would be standing on the shoulders of giants like Roberts and Dole as he takes the next step toward the U.S. Senate. Now, he said he wasn't sure whether or not he had won, even though he had taken the lead in Johnson County, which doesn't happen very often with Western Kansas candidates. But he said it was when he took the lead in Butler County that he knew for sure something was happening tonight.
I truly have been focused in the moment, but certainly understand what's at risk here, what's at stake, and that's the Republican majority in the Senate, that we have to be the backstop.
He points to the strategy of sticking to what he has to offer Kansas as helping him win.
My job as a senator will to be empower local communities to solve their own problems.
Well, it was a landslide and something that was expected by most. She won by nearly 90% of the vote, but despite some big Democratic money supporting her, she's now trying to paint herself as an independent in a speech she gave in the last couple of hours. Bollier has much more money than Marshall right now, raising $7.7 million versus Marshall's $2.7, and she's already buying more airtime for a new round of ads this week geared at the general election. When she spoke around 8:45, the projections were not out, so she talked about the Republican field as a whole. She called all of them yes men who put party over constituents. She's very much going to paint herself as an independent of her party in an effort to win as many voters as she can.
I've always put my constituents above any partisan political agenda, and I always will. You'll never hear my potential opponent say that.
And joining Bollier and Marshall on the general election ballot will be Libertarian Jason Buckley. Now, there's lots to talk about in that race and many others this last week. Joining me here on the desk tonight, we have Dr. Neil Allen from Wichita State University, and joining me by Zoom, Dr. Russell Arbin Fox, political scientist from Friends University. Thank you both so much for being here. Russell, since we've got you up, I'm going to start with you. A lot of talk about this being the best chance the Democrats have had since the 1930s of actually taking a Senate seat, but best is how good?
Sorry, I was muted there. Best is not terribly good for Kansas Democrats. Barbara Bollier is without a doubt the best funded, best advised, really overall the best crafted Democrat that has put her candidacy forward for the U.S. Senate in Kansas in many decades. But we remain a strongly Republican state. In order for a Democrat to win a statewide race, as everyone well understands who takes a look at Kansas politics, Democrats have to win Republicans. That means that you have to have the Republicans running a Republican that actually turns off some Republican voters. If Chris Kobach had been the Republican senatorial nominee, then the roadmap for Bollier to pick up those kind of disgruntled Republican voters would have been clear. The roadmap for Bollier to capture Republican voters from Marshall, though, is going to be much harder for her.
So as we look at this race, Neil, and we're looking at the national scale, we're seeing a lot of attention because this is about more than just Kansas.
Well, you know, the majority in the U.S. Senate is in play right now. And so Democrats right now have 47 seats. They need to get to 50 plus the vice president. And they've got a good shot at doing so. And they can get there without the Kansas seat. And while Marshall is a far superior candidate to Kobach, I think this race still is worth paying attention to. Boyer is probably going to outraise Marshall. She's going to outspend Marshall. But this is still a fundamentally Republican state. But there was a poll out today from a Democratic firm that found Marshall just up by 1 percentage point, although it was like 43 to 42, and the undecideds will probably break in a conservative direction. But I think that if this is a big national victory on the national level for Joe Biden, which is quite possible, then the Kansas seat might be in play if Boyer does everything right and Marshall is not able to craft an independent connection with voters independent of President Trump.
Well, and you and I have talked before about the fact that Marshall really has some ground to make up after the primary. So, Russell, coming to you to talk about that, what does Marshall need to do to shore up his support in Kansas after that really very negative primary?
He has to do two different things. First of all, he has to maintain his position as the establishment Republican, which of course he is. I mean, he had the support from all sorts of Republican leaders, all sorts of major Republican power players all across the state. So he has to maintain that position. But he has to do that in a shifting context. As we have seen from some of the other results from election night, the Kansas Republican Party is in some ways becoming a more conservative animal. And that makes it harder for people carrying that banner to reach out to moderate Republicans and to reach out to independents. And so he has to find a way to do that. I don't think that's by any means beyond his skills as a politician. I think as we get into the general election campaign, they're going to find a groove to settle Marshall in that will work pretty well for him. But of course, it's going to take some repairing from the primary disputes.
Well, and we're already seeing some of that happening here in Kansas starting on Friday. The fact this race is so hot on the national scale is not just a local issue, already drawing more money into Kansas. One PAC starting Friday sinking millions into the race to support Roger Marshall, as I showed in this story from Cake News.
Public bathrooms stay separate.
He is a tireless champion for border security.
The conservative choice, Dr. Roger Marshall.
There's one thing just about every Kansan has been looking forward to this week, an end to all those pesky political ads.
Yeah, they're about to drive me nuts.
I'm ready to see them gone.
But just 2 days after the primary, those ads?
I'm a rancher. We farm and raise cattle.
Already on their way back. Republican Political Action Committee One Nation has begun buying airtime for ads supporting Roger Marshall for the Senate, set to begin airing Friday. One Nation spent more than $100,000 at Cake TV alone, and a Wall Street Journal reporter says the PAC is spending more than $4 million statewide.
Marshall had a really tough primary race. He got hit from other campaigns, national Republican groups, national Democratic groups, so he's got some work to do to rebuild his image. And also,
political scientist Dr. Neil Allen says this is also about fundraising. Roger Marshall has only $1 million to spend compared to the $4.5 million Democrat Barbara Bollier has in the bank. Then there's how spending in Kansas could play into the national races for control of the Senate.
If the Democrats can force the national Republicans like Mitch McConnell to put resources into Kansas, that's just resources they can't use in other places where they need them.
But all that extra money coming into the state, not enough for those who are over all those ads.
It's only going to a limited number of people if you look at it. It doesn't benefit the people of Kansas directly.
There's a limit to everything, and I think that they've taken it to the limit.
Taking it to the limit, kind of the story of politics, really. But as we look at this, talk about that differential in fundraising between Marshall and Bollier at this point, how much does this kind of national help make up for that difference?
Well, I think that, there's a good chance that Marshall will be outraised by Bollier, but he doesn't have to make up that difference because he starts with such massive advantages because he's a Republican running in Kansas. And but the difficulty is, so much of this election is going to be about President Trump. I mean, Roger Marshall has only been in office during the Trump administration. He doesn't have this independent connection to voters that his predecessors like Senators Roberts and Moran had coming out of Western Kansas. Now that's probably good enough, and also Marshall has the benefit of having no votes in support or a proposition to the Brownback tax agenda, and having himself have basically zero connections to Chris Kobach, because the Democrats can beat those two people in Kansas. It's not clear if they can beat anybody else.
Yeah. Well, and Barbara Bollier is kind of an interesting factor because up until about a year and a half or so ago, she was a Republican. So, Russell, I'm going to come to you on this one. How much does that help her? How much does that hurt her in this race?
Well, I mean, it helps her because it is part of an overall package that she is presenting to voters, that she is, someone who obviously has moderate, maybe even conservative sensibilities. Those were the sorts of things that she acted upon while she was a Republican. But she's the kind of Republican who just can't stand Donald Trump and left the party over issues of the state party's support for Donald Trump, as well as the state party's resistance to Medicaid expansion. She is going to be able to use that to sell herself. And it will be interesting to see how Marshall chooses to position himself and how the state Republican Party chooses to position Marshall in response to the particular package that Bollier provides. There was an ad from One Nation that I was just listening to on the radio this morning, and I thought it was really interesting how it pushed really strongly some Trumpian, even Kobachian themes, talking about protecting our borders, but never mentioned either person by name, never mentioned the president. Instead, it talked all about how Marshall was in the tradition of Dole and Roberts and others, really kind of playing up the establishment conservative vibe that they want for this candidate.
Neil, how much of that do you think has to do with the fact that Trump, yes, he won Kansas and he'll probably win Kansas again, but it's not like it was a dominating win in 2016. It was 56% if I remember my numbers correctly. It was not like 70 or 80%. Kansas is a lot more split than most people think of it as being.
I mean, Kansas is not the most Republican state in the Union, and the fact that we haven't elected a Democrat to the Senate since the 1930s has to do with the fact that Democrats didn't get a shot at Republicans in a couple big landslide years in the 50s and 60s, and also Bob Dole narrowly pulled out a win in '74. But also, I mean, President Trump will probably run behind his showing 4 years ago here. But also, I mean, President Trump is at the low end of his popularity right now. But also, Republican voters tend to like opposition to immigration and discussion of national Democrats as a problem. And Barbara Bollier might kind of look like the swing voter in Kansas, a former Republican who has problems with the current Republican Party in the state of the nation. But on the other hand, when she was in the Republican Party in Topeka, elected in office, she was voting like a Democrat and fully part of the Democrats' coalition. So her switching really just more reflects her issue positioning as a politician.
All right. Well, we do have some other races to talk about today. Of course, Pat Roberts' Senate seat wasn't the only trip to D.C. on the line. There were also 4 congressional races, and the results mean we'll see at least 2 new faces representing Kansas. Let's start in the big 1st district, Western Kansas. Former Kansas Lieutenant Governor Tracy Mann won the Republican nomination there to replace Roger Marshall in that seat. He took out Bill Clifford of Garden City in a hard-fought race that was heavily criticized for its negative ads, especially one from Mann accusing Clifford of acting like a Democrat by helping Somali immigrants move to southwest Kansas, even though Somalia is a, quote, terrorist hotbed. Mann will face off against Democrat Callie Barnett in November. In the 2nd district, Kansas State Treasurer Jake LaTurner toppled incumbent Congressman Steve Watkins, winning mainly on the issue of electability in the general election. Watkins faces multiple felony charges related to his voter registration in the 2019 elections. LaTurner will take on Democrat Michelle De La Isla, who has more money in the bank as they move into the general election. In the 3rd district, Democrat incumbent Sharice Davids moves forward. She'll face off against Republican challenger Amanda Adkins, a former Kansas Republican Party chair with close ties to former Governor Sam Brownback. And in the 4th district, Congressman Ron Estes will face Laura Lombard in November. Okay, so there's a lot in that 4 different major races. Russell, I'm going to start with you. What do you think is the real headline out of the congressional races this week?
I think the headline is the fact that while the ratio of conservative Republicans to moderate Republicans in the state of Kansas is always shifting and it always responding to different variables. It remains a Republican state, and the Republican establishment really does have the power to get things done if they choose to get done. I think that the victory of LaTurner over Steve Watkins, and to a certain degree the victory of Roger Marshall over Chris Kobach, are both reflective of the fact that however conservative Kansas is, it's also really quite Republican, and there are tens of thousands of voters who go to the polls kind of listening to what the Republican Party is putting forward as the candidates they're going to support. I think that one message here is that the Republican establishment in Kansas has far from been eclipsed in its influence over elections.
But that is certainly something that Democrats are hoping to change, especially with the 2nd district.
That's right. And of the 4 districts in the state, the 3rd might be competitive if things turn against Democrats, but Davis seems pretty solid. But the 2nd district looks like it'll be very competitive. Now, I think Watkins would have started out probably an underdog. LaTurner is a way better candidate. And Della Isla seems to be raising money. She's clearly an underdog, but I think she'll get big vote out of Lawrence, big vote out of Topeka. And, the Democrats nearly got that district last time, and it might be interesting in the fall.
Nearly got that district last time and did take a lot of that area in the governor's race.
Oh, that's right. And I think also that the fact that you've got Topeka, Lawrence there, and also you have some outer suburbs of Kansas City means that I think President Trump will lose more in that area compared to other parts of the state. My guess is it probably isn't quite enough for Della Isla, but she is clearly an interesting candidate. And also for the Democrats, if they lose that race, then they get to have a treasurer for a couple of years because Kelly will get to appoint somebody who will probably then lose in 2 years.
All right. Some interesting facts there. Of course, there were also some interesting races at the state level as well. As Russell mentioned, one trend we saw in those races, a turn to the right for Republicans. As we take a big picture look at the races for Kansas State House, we see a trend of conservatives ousting moderate incumbents, possibly ending the ability of moderate Republicans to work with Democrats on issues like Medicaid expansion. Among those gone from the Senate, Bruce Givens of El Dorado, Dan Goddard from Parsons, Randall Hardy of Salina, and Ed Berger of Hutchinson. House moderates who lost this week include Diana Dirks of Salina and J.C. Moore of Clearwater. Though at least one of those races between Goddard and Virgil Peck remains tight with just 35 votes between them as of Friday morning. Another race that's still tight, the 37th House District, where Aaron Coleman has just a 3-vote lead over the incumbent Stan Fraunfelter. Coleman is a 19-year-old candidate who was roundly criticized by both Democrats and Republicans for online comments he made, hoping COVID would take out non-mask-wearing Republicans and make it easier for Democrats to win in November. In Wichita, Patrick Penn, a candidate recruited by leading Republicans and endorsed by former Governor Jeff Collier, toppled sitting State Representative Michael Capps. The party had repudiated Capps again after the Wichita Eagle used business records to at least tangentially connect him to attack ads against Brandon Whipple in the mayor's race earlier this year. Once again, there's so many different state races. We can't cover them all. But let's start with this turn to the right and the moderates losing. Is it a repeat of the turn to the right that we saw in 2012?
I think that's fair to say so. And I mean, it's a lot of the same seats where moderates were able to reverse their losses of 12 and 16, and now they've had another reversal. And this is a big deal for state politics. In the last session, there was a majority in both the House and the Senate for Medicaid expansion. There's probably going to be one in the House, although it might get tighter. In the Senate, it's very unclear not just whether you have enough to force a vote if the majority leadership doesn't want it, but there might not even be 21 votes in the Senate, depending on how well Democrats are going to do in the fall. And also, a lot of these losses by moderates are in places where Democrats either aren't running a candidate or they're areas where the Democrats are pretty weak. They picked up a couple of targets. But this is getting us closer to where it kind of looked like we were in the early part of the last decade, which was that if there's going to be opposition to conservative Republicans, it's going to have to mostly come from Democrats.
Okay, so Russell, what does this do to the governor's legislative priorities?
Well, obviously it's going to make those priorities, the primary one being Medicaid expansion, a little bit more difficult. She's got some good arguments in her pocket. I mean, we have Missouri right next door where, as a ballot initiative, the voters approved Medicaid expansion. So that means now Kansas is completely surrounded, north, south, east, and west, by states that have accepted Medicaid expansion. But, that doesn't necessarily mean that conservative voters will be changing their minds. I think it's important to also reflect upon the fact that Governor Kelly is administrating a state that's in demographic transition. And this demographic transition has been going on for a long time. It will continue to go on. There's always lots of exceptions and lots of particular races. But generally speaking, if you take a look at these places where moderate Republicans lose to conservative Republican challengers, what you're seeing is places where the moderate Republican voters that would have come out in the primary to support those people have become Democrats. We're talking about urban and suburban areas where moderate Republicans are becoming Democrats, voting in the Democratic primary, voting for Democrats in the general, and thus the remaining Republicans, who often still have the numbers to win, are that much more conservative because the moderates have gone away.
Well, and one thing that a lot of folks brought up to me is that some of this may be a result of the Senate race, which really brought out a lot more conservative voters in the primary.
That makes some sense. And also we should remember that Congressman Marshall is not a moderate. He might have been the choice of moderates who voted in the Republican primary, but he's not himself a moderate. And there's all kinds of other reasons as pulling moderate and centrist voters out of the Republican primary electorate, voting for Democrats for president, there's competitive Democrats in lots of different districts. Like here in Wichita, in the district that's represented now by conservative State Senate President Susan Wagle, there were two very active Democratic candidates, so there was something in the neighborhood where I live to actually vote for if you're a Democrat, and so that all changes the Republican electorate. But also, though, it's just that, we're talking about a small number of people that decides a state Senate primary. We're talking about four figures, of people, not five. These races are very tight. And so it can but we should note here that being a moderate in the Republican Party these days is a difficult place to be, even in a state like Kansas where they're relatively stronger than other places.
Yeah. Well, certainly you talked about some of those tight races. We talked about some of them in our story as well. A lot of changes in this election. The results may be in, but days after election night, election workers were still counting mail-in ballots, all because of the pandemic's impact on the election. KSN's Crystal Sherrill shows us why and how.
The work is not over for the Sedgwick County Election Office.
We are still getting ballots. Of course, we had ballots that were dropped off late, last night, as far as by later in the day, too late for us to verify signatures and get them included. We have ballots that are dropped off at polling places. Now we're dealing with anything that comes in the mail that was postmarked, and we receive it by Friday. We count those as well.
It was the county's first time releasing a flyer encouraging people to vote by mail. Election Commissioner Tabitha Lehman says if that flyer is sent out again for future primaries, they'll do it a lot sooner.
We had a lot of people that didn't follow those instructions. That caused an incredible amount of work for my staff trying to follow up on that.
Workers faced several challenges during the primary, including a large workload, and fewer poll workers showed up than expected.
We ended up having to send 6 of our office staff out to polling places to work just to keep the polls open to make sure people could vote. And that affected our ability to be ready on election night as well.
The election office is now in conversation to get more help for the general election, while Commissioner Lehman continues her battle with cancer. For now, workers will continue going through mail-in ballots, then canvassing and the election audit. The work continues for the big day in November, which brings challenges of its own.
I have a very big concern if we struggled this much to get enough election workers for the primary. We need hundreds more for the general, and that is terrifying to me.
And another interesting point, too, while this appears to have gone through all right, despite kind of a few hurdles from the pandemic, the State Department on Election Day announced a $10 million bounty for anybody who had information about hacking attempts, and that's across the country. How much of these changes do we think may have impacted the results?
I think very little, if zero. And some of that is because of the work of election administrators. And I want to just take a bit of personal privilege here to talk about Tabitha Lehman, the election administrator for Cedric County. She happens to be a friend. We work together. We placed an intern in her office. And the fact that she is working a regular day while she's under cancer treatment is just a phenomenal sort of thing.
I've actually absolutely been floored. She's responded to emails saying, I'm in chemo right now, but here.
Right, but I mean, and she's right that we need a massive increase in election workers. A lot of our normal election workers don't want to go to work at the polls because of real health concerns. At Wichita State, I'm going to create a special kind of election worker internship class to see if I can drive some more people there. And also one thing to note, in Kansas, 16 and 17-year-olds, as long as they would normally be eligible to vote where they would work, can work on election day as election workers, because this is the work of democracy, and we need a lot more people because this election is going to be crazy and important.
All right. And Russell, as we move forward very quickly, what are your thoughts? What have we learned from this election that we need to apply to November?
I think what we've learned is that a lot of the things that have already been well established in many other states can be implemented here in Kansas. Mail-in ballots can work. We can make the kind of infrastructure necessary to really handle the challenges of an election. And it's due to really hardworking people like Tabitha Lehman and so many other people that have really gone above and beyond to keep things functioning during this year. I agree with everything Neil said. There's a lot of hard workers out there, and we need to do our best to find those who can assist them in that work.
Well, thank you again for sharing your perspectives with us today, Russell, Neil. I've really appreciated what you had to say. We'd also like to thank our news partners at KSN News, the Wichita Eagle, and Cake News for sharing their work with us each week. We'd love to hear what you think. Continue the conversation with us on social media. Just look for Pilar Pedraza TV and KPTS Channel 8 on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. For now, have a great week.
Southwest National Bank has proudly served Wichita and its surrounding communities for over 100 years. We are happy to support KPTS, Public Television for Kansas.